Hey everyone, welcome. We're just gonna let folks trickle in for a moment and then we'll get started. If you'd like to share your name and your pronoun in the chat, that would be great. Okay, to be mindful of everyone's time, we'll get started. Hi there, and welcome to today's session. My name's Hannah and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a project management officer here at EGAL. For any participants who are not able to see me, I'm wearing a blue shirt, glasses, and I have black hair. As the moderator for today's session, I'll be mostly hiding in the background to make sure things run smoothly. Since we are doing this in a virtual format, I'll go over a few of the technical aspects to orient you before we get started. First, as you've noticed when you arrived, this session is being recorded for internal quality assurance purposes only. We'd like to remind everyone, for safety and comfort of everyone attending, screen recording is not permitted. Next, for anyone not familiar with Zoom's interactive features, I'd like to just take a few quick moments to run through these features with everyone. First, you should see a ribbon with buttons, such as chat, at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see these buttons, just scroll your mouse or swipe along the bottom of your screen and the ribbon should pop up. Clicking the chat button will open the chat pod. Once open, you'll see a drop-down menu that allows you to choose who can see your chat contributions. We encourage you to share your comments with everyone, but you're also welcome to send private messages to the session hosts if you wish. Your comments to remain anonymous. I will also be dropping in any links or handouts throughout using the chat pod. So you'll want to keep it handy. Please feel free to drop in any questions that come up using the Q&A pod at any point during the session. We will leave some time at the end to answer all questions. And also note that the closed captioning has been enabled for the session. If you'd like to show or hide the subtitles on your screen, click the CC button, which you can find beside the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Finally, if you encounter any issues during today's webinar, do not hesitate to reach out to me privately by chat. Before I pass the mic over to Celeste and Ellie, our researchers, I'd like to offer a brief introduction to EGAL and our land acknowledgement. For those of you who do not know us yet, EGAL Canada is a leading organization for 2S LGBTQI people and issues. We improve and save lives through research, education, awareness, and by advocating for human rights and equality in Canada and around the world. Our work helps create societies and systems that reflect the universal truth that all persons are equal and none is other. Although we have participants joining us from various locations, we at EGAL are located in downtown Toronto, and as such, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, Mississaugas of the Credit, and Haudenosaunee people. It is also important to acknowledge that I myself am a settler on these lands. The Indigenous people have been living and working on since time immemorial and continue to have community on today. The social and economic powers afforded to settlers today is deeply tied to this history. It is important that all settlers today recognize the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people and to commit to making the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I ask that we all remain cognizant of colonial contexts in which we are embedded as we reflect and discuss the topics of today's session. Without further ado, passing it off to Celeste and Ellie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the second of 4 webinars in EGAL's Research Highlight webinar series. Today's presentation is highlights from EGAL's Aging and Living Well, Beyond Health Considerations for LGBTQI Older Adults project. My name is Celeste Pang. I use she and they pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, and a co-lead of the Critical Queer and Trans Research Hub And from 2020 to 2023, I had the great pleasure of being a senior research officer in IGAL's research department. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Ellie McLennan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. As Celeste said, my name is Ellie McLennan, and I use she, her pronouns. And I was a research coordinator and officer at IGAL before starting my current master's at Toronto Metropolitan University.
So today we're going to share some highlights from the Aging and Living Well project, focusing on the research aspect of the project. And just a note in advance that the report was published earlier in the fall, so all of this information is available there as well. So to begin, some project background and methodology. So the Aging and Living Well project as a whole is a multi-phase research, education, and awareness project focused on aging and living well among 2S LGBTQI older adults in Canada. So we began this project in 2020, recognizing the need for increased critical knowledge and awareness of 2S LGBTQI older adults' aging needs and priorities. The project was and continues to be supported by the Slate Family Foundation. There are 4 phases to the project as a whole. So the first phase, which we're focusing on today, was our research phase. So for this, we conducted a national qualitative study exploring the social needs, material concerns, and conceptions or ideas of living well among LGBTQI older adults across Canada. In our second phase, we developed the National Resource Center on 2S LGBTQI Aging. We did this in collaboration with the National Institute on Aging out of TMU. This website is complete and it's available for public use, and we have a link to it at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will also tell you a little bit more about phase 3 and 4, which are the development of virtual educational modules as well as an awareness campaign.
So the purpose of this national interview-based study was to expand and deepen our understanding of how older LGBTQI adults themselves conceptualize well-being and what is needed for our communities to live well into old age. By asking about aging and living well, we aim to delve into the complex social realities and intersectional experiences that LGBTQI older adults in Canada have, and to identify areas for action and social change. Thus, our research questions were, what does aging and living well look like for older 2S LGBTQI older adults in Canada? And what could it look like? And what social changes are needed to better enable 2S LGBTQI older adults to live and age well and in their own terms? Thank you. To explore these questions, in the summer of 2021, we conducted interviews with older adults living in cities, towns, and rural areas across Canada. We asked them about their current living situations and material concerns, such as housing and finances, their experiences accessing healthcare and services, their thoughts on end of life, and about what well-being and aging well looks like, or what it could look like for them. So we conducted a total of 48 interviews with LGBTQI older adults, but there were no Two-Spirit participants, which is why we're using LGBTQI. Interview questions were grouped to focus on material considerations, family relations, care and support, healthcare access, and end-of-life considerations. We also engaged 2 advisory committees, one committee made up of older adults themselves, and one of agency and organization representatives. Thank you. We spoke with older adults from across 8 provinces. No territories were represented. As you can see in the figures, most of the participants were cisgender, though the study did include 5 trans, non-binary, intersex, or genderqueer participants. And participants ranged in age from 64 to 81, with an average age being 70 years old. And most participants in the study identified as lesbian or gay. The majority of participants identified as white or acknowledged some sort of white privilege, while just under 1/5 of participants identified themselves as BIPOC of different backgrounds. Most participants were born in Canada, though some participants had immigrated here and shared about some of those experiences. And 3/4 of participants were living in urban settings, leaving 1/4 living rurally. And I'll now pass it back over to Celeste, who's going to introduce our key findings.
Thank you, Ellie. So in the presentation today and in the published report, we discuss key findings across 5 domains. So these are employment, housing, social connection and disconnection, healthcare access, and death and end-of-life well-being. So in the segment that follows, we will share some brief highlights from these sections, and we invite you to go to the report to read more. So we'll begin with employment. So in terms of employment, we were interested in understanding more about participants' employment trajectories and how these trajectories impacted their current socioeconomic situations, and also what their experiences and navigation of discrimination on the basis of identity can teach us today. In exploring these key questions, we learned about the complex ways in which LGBTQI older adults have navigated employment over the life course. We also learned more about why some folks continue to work into older age past a traditional retirement age. Significantly, past employment trajectories of participants were shaped by historical conditions of pathologization and criminalization of LGBTQI identities. So we learned how homophobia, transphobia, and sexism impacted career trajectories, from lost opportunities and wage gaps to guiding participants' career choices. In light of this, participants related how they carefully navigated disclosure of their identities and how their fears of being outed and facing discrimination informed workplace relationships and career trajectories. And as we think about current societal conditions today and employment-related questions, unfortunately, these experiences and navigations remain very relevant. So one example of navigating disclosure was shared by a gay man who at the time was in his 70s, who had previously worked in social services. And he shared with us, a typical question will be from parents, well, do you have children? Of course, I learned to say, we're here to talk about your family, not mine. I kind of ducked out of that. I was out to co-workers and bosses, yes. It doesn't mean that they knew anything beyond that. It was very painful for me to feel like I had to hide that aspect of myself. Another participant who was doing temp work shared how he faced discrimination at the point of hiring, telling us, I sat in that office from 5:30 in the morning until 9 p.m. and not have my name called. And you know, so much that I stopped wearing a pride button and started going to a different temp agency. So we see here how this person basically navigated hiding his identity or making it less visible in order to increase his chances of securing employment. And then alongside LGBTQI identity-based discrimination, women participants also related experiences of sexism in the workplace, including barriers to career advancement and lower wages as well. In terms of working into older age, so while many LGBTQI older adults we interviewed were retired or were no longer working, so about 3/4 of them, about 1/4 of participants, or 10 of the 48 people that we talked to, did continue to work full-time, part-time, or in the gig economy. So one person in this situation shared a sentiment that others did as well. And she said, I absolutely have to work, and that's hanging over my head. It's not easy because my age is working against me and has been for a long time. I've been putting in applications because that's what I want to do. So our findings show the financial necessity and lack of resources that caused some of these folks who were seeking work or working into older age to do so. On the screen here, we have a figure of the household income levels of participants. So you can see that we had a wide range from people making under $20,000 a year to some who had over $100,000 a year in annual household income. And we did see that people in the lower income range were more likely to be working or seeking work due to financial necessity. And we also heard how ageism and ableism together impacted the job options that those seeking work had. And in some cases, these forms of discrimination prompted people to retrain for positions that they thought they'd be more likely to be hired for. The second key domain that we explored was housing. So our research questions going into the research in regards to housing were, what housing situations and concerns do LGBTQI older adults face? And what possibilities for futures of housing can be made and imagined? We organized our findings into several key domains, including housing insecurity and aging in place and queer housing models. So in terms of housing insecurity, we considered how among participants, homeowners and renters alike expressed concerns about rising housing costs, including their financial ability to make rent and afford other living expenses. So in addition to this kind of financial housing insecurity, we also learned about concerns for safety and belonging. And these were key considerations for participants, both in their current housing situations and in their thoughts about future housing situations. And we found this quite interesting because while this often comes up in relation to long-term care and other sorts of congregate living, so a concern with safety and belonging, which our report does also describe, we found that this also to be the case among renters or people who were seeking to rent, as well as homeowners in apartment-type dwellings. So the two quotes on this slide highlight contrasting experiences in this regard. One partnered gay man in his 60s shared with us, everybody knew that we were the gay couple on the first floor of an apartment building. We only had one real negative thing happen to us. One year in Pride, we hung up the rainbow flag and a neighbor, she didn't like it. She complained to us directly, and then she complained to the building council, and she was told, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. They're not breaking any rules, regulations, or bylaws. So there we are. So in this case, we see an example where someone was experiencing some homophobia, but then essentially the people in their building council stood up for them and used policy as a way to say that that was unacceptable. Conversely, one single intersex woman in her 70s who was seeking a new housing situation shared, when I'm going to go out and look for a place to live, I can just imagine the time I'm going to have. It's just going to be, oh, sorry, it's rented. I'm just imagining the excuses I'm going to get when I won't be able to find a place to live. That needs to be corrected. It needs to be a situation whereby, yes, this is a senior citizen. She is intersex, or she is transgender, or she is whatever. We need to be assured and really well advised that there are legal means in place to protect this person. So here is a person sharing relative lack of sense of safety and lack of security that she will be able to find another housing situation. In thinking about future housing situations, participants expressed strong desires to age at home across the board, whether home was their current physical abode or a sense of belonging. Many of them anticipated needs for home care assistance or other types of social service assistance in the future, but were concerned about accessing this and about the accessibility, so the physical accessibility of their homes, as well as the state of their finances in the future. So, for example, it was significant that while a number of participants were homeowners, this didn't mean that they fully own their homes, and it didn't mean that they would have the cash flow to, for example, retrofit those homes to be more accessible. With regards to us LGBTQI specific housing and care options, while participants valued access to community and intergenerational connections, there were divided opinions about this. So within the report, we explore this range of perspectives, including why the older adults we spoke to desired us LGBTQI specific or specifically affirming living situations, and the reasons that others expressed hesitance about this.
Thanks, Celeste. So social connection was also a really important consideration in the lives and well-being of our participants, and they saw a huge range of connections in their lives. In terms of our key questions, we wanted to know what connections participants had, valued, and in what ways, if any, they felt disconnected. Next slide, please. In terms of our main findings, participants described diverse social, familial, and care networks, and they also found community through participation in different activist and volunteer efforts, faith groups, and recreational activities. Participants also spoke about lost connections throughout their lives, including due to family members and friends' rejection of their identities. Some participants also talked about feeling lonely or not feeling they had people that they could depend on, wishing they had greater social interactions and or closer ties. And unsurprisingly, the COVID-19 pandemic also significantly impacted participants' social lives. As well, some of these interviews took place during lockdowns. In terms of connection specifically, in discussions of who was around, distinctions between friends and families of origin, and families of origin being those families they were born into or raised in as children, versus families of choice, were often blurred, where who was around and who could be depended on often mattered more. And many participants had ties to families of origin, children, chosen families, and a mixture of these connections. Partnership status also played a really large role in feeling socially connected. Over a third of our participants lived with partners, and a handful had partners they were not living with, while others were single or widowed. And for most of our participants who were partnered, this did provide some level of support typically. Lastly, participants also found really important connections through communities and organized activities, such as being involved with LGBTQI organizations or services put on by these organizations, faith groups, and a variety of hobbies. These communities also provided a sense of purpose in addition to feeling socially connected. And here we highlight a quote from an older lesbian woman who commented on the significance of having strong social connections, especially during times of need. And I quote, "I'm very blessed with the friends that I have. I'm an only child, so I've always been of the feeling that my friends are my family. When my spouse got sick, it blew us away the number of people that came to us. When she ended up in the hospital towards the end, I put the call out because we really thought we were going to lose her that weekend. And she was absolutely blown away by the number of people. It was just a constant stream." So here we can see some participants in our study felt extraordinarily connected socially and had a really strong network they could rely on. Whereas in contrast, we'll now move on to talking about social disconnection and challenges that came up when we were talking about the social lives of our participants. And the isolation, loneliness, and challenges participants described in terms of living well and having good connections. So many participants had faced rejection and exclusion due to coming out. This was sometimes from friends and community members, and also families of origin and or from children, which often had lasting impacts. The age that participants came out also really influenced how this might affect the social lives and feelings of connectedness, both generally and within the queer community, as some participants had come out while they were really young, while some had come out when they were much older. Participants also spoke about loss, both kind of at the personal and community level, which impacted their social circumstances. So this included the loss of partners, as some of our participants were widowed, friends they'd lost, as well as other losses at the community level, one of which being the HIV/AIDS crisis, which resulted in the loss of many LGBTQI community members and loved ones, and had lasting impacts on many of our participants' lives and communities. As well, given when the interviews were conducted, and since the pandemic, there have been many participants who described feeling really isolated, which surfaced and sometimes or often worsened underlying social dynamics and posing challenges in feeling socially connected. This also highlighted the technological barriers and how many older LGBTQI adults and other older adults generally were somewhat left behind during these periods. And lastly, exclusion within the LGBTQI community was noted as a major concern, with discussions around racism, ageism, and ableism, as an example, being commented on by our participants, which posed challenges to participants feeling they belonged within the queer community as well. Which brings us to two quotes that captures some of these experiences of disconnection. The first from a lesbian woman who described the fallout of her coming out, and I quote, "My daughter, in the initial stages of finding out that her mother had fallen in love with another woman, refused to let me see my grandchildren. They were very embarrassed, and there were all sorts of negative things. They were very angry." Like other participants, this experience highlights how coming out can sometimes leave older LGBTQI adults isolated from their families and support networks. Similarly, in the second quote, we have a lesbian woman who spoke of the racism within the LGBTQI community itself. And I quote, "There's a lot of racism in gay communities. It was very bad. I don't have an English name, so I wasn't included in a lot of lesbian things. We have to talk about exclusion and racism in the gay community." Again, this sentiment was echoed in other conversations with participants, highlighting the diversity within the LGBTQI community and the multiple other identities participants hold, and the difficulty of feeling belonging when some aspects of one identity might not be widely accepted in one community or another. And so in close, these experiences reinforce the various and often unique barriers older LGBTQI adults face in leading fulfilling social lives, which is a really important aspect of aging and living well. Moving on to our next theme, healthcare access. The LGBTQI older adults we interviewed described a host of experiences related to accessing or trying to access healthcare services. And they described their struggles in finding care providers and navigating healthcare systems, disclosure-related decisions, and healthcare encounters that had gone well or could be significantly improved. Participants had varying healthcare needs and lived with a range of chronic conditions, including arthritis, cancer, depression, HIV, and respiratory illnesses for which they'd sought care, which also informed some of these experiences. They had various perspectives on health and well-being and what they needed to live well beyond just healthcare considerations. In response to our key questions, looking at barriers to good care and what helps when it comes to affirming care, two key themes emerged. So first, disclosure of identity was a major consideration for older LGBTQI adults when navigating care systems. And second, there were numerous healthcare needs that were going unmet for participants related to rural access, out-of-pocket costs, doctor shortages, mental health and related support shortages, and finding affirming long-term care options. We'll first look at disclosure. As when asking about how participants navigated healthcare systems, we heard a range of experiences in how they navigated disclosure. Some participants had described really negative experiences with care providers, ranging from providers refusing to recognize their relationships or to even touch them, as well as including general silence around the topic of sexuality or relationships, even when this seemed relevant to care. And these concerns extended to recognition of partners or significant others by healthcare systems as well. Participants also differed really widely in their approach to disclosing their identity with care professionals, but overall, there was often an apprehension surrounding coming out to care providers. Many participants were selective in their disclosure, only bringing up their identities or partners when they thought this was really relevant to their care, while others just tried to avoid mentioning their partners or identity outright to avoid being treated badly. And others had just said it just didn't come up with providers, or providers didn't ask about their identity or sexuality or gender. And in contrast, some participants were really upfront and direct when they were talking about their identity with providers. And so when we look forward, we look at two quotes from participants on this topic of disclosure. And the first is on navigating healthcare systems from a lesbian woman. And I quote, "I always research. I don't put myself in that kind of position. So I knew who I was going to." She, like many other participants, would try to ensure she visited professionals who were known to be affirming among community members prior to seeing a new professional. And they had all different strategies of trying to locate these affirming professionals, but it was commented widely that it's difficult to find such providers, both as physicians and primary care physicians and specialists. The second quote from a genderqueer woman described the homophobia her and her partner had experienced by a healthcare provider, and I quote, "We encountered it before my partner's surgery. A nurse was actually quite hostile. She was actually okay when she thought I was a man. She was fine. I got really good service when she thought I was male. And then when she realized I was female, she was hostile. She was rude, dismissive, abrupt, and unpleasant." Unfortunately, this experience was not entirely unique to this participant, and disclosing one's identity or who one's partner was often resulted in ramifications for participants in the past or more recent experiences. That brings us to limitations to care, another theme that emerged in relation to healthcare access, as there were lots of commentary on the limitation to Canada's universal healthcare systems and coverage, and how they were proving to be insufficient in meeting the needs of older LGBTQI adults. Out-of-pocket costs for healthcare-related services and medications were a great concern. This included things like dental care, mental health care, physiotherapy, vision care, dermatology, and prescription drugs. These were all listed as kind of high-cost areas that needed more comprehensive coverage, and were a really great concern for many participants. Rural residents also discussed the challenges related to transportation to services and providers, primary care physician shortages, and really long wait times for specialists in their area as significant challenges to accessing good care. As well, mental health, addictions, and grief support were also noted as areas of need, both for older adults generally, but also providers that could meet the specific mental health care needs for the LGBTQI community, including locating affirming providers. And then finally, as Celeste commented on in the housing section, affirming long-term care options were a great source of anxiety for participants and an area needing improvement. Many participants were extremely worried about what their care may look like down the road by both providers and fellow residents if they needed to move into a long-term care or retirement residence as they aged. And this was similar with home care concerns, which was again a priority for older adults to be able to age in place. But securing affordable and affirming home care seems unavailable or out of reach for many participants. And so we shared 2 quotes from our participants on some of the challenges they faced in accessing good care. The first in blue from a gay man describing challenges he had faced in locating care, which were echoed by other participants across Canada. I quote, "Well, Nova Scotia is in worse condition than Ontario. We did get a doctor. There was a 5 to 6 year wait, but I managed to pull some strings and get in. We both try very hard to access mental health support, but there isn't a lot. I did the paperwork before I left Ontario. I had a psychiatrist there, and she sent it over here. And I'm just now getting an initial interview tomorrow with a psychiatrist. So it's been 4 years, but it was due to my digging and my work." This participant, like many others, really had to put in extra effort to try to find care providers. And these types of barriers do limit care options for a lot of older adults and older LGBTQI adults. The second quote is from a genderqueer woman and speaks to some of the specific challenges older LGBTQI adults face when accessing care. As she says, "I went to a grief group after my partner died. I felt definitely that my grief didn't rate quite as highly as real grief, when you lose a real partner. I never went back. I reported that to the organizers." So again, recognition of and respect for LGBTQI partners or spouses was shared by other participants, again highlighting an area for our healthcare systems to improve in the future for older LGBTQI adults. Now I'll pass it back over to Celeste to continue on with our findings.
And finally, in the study, we explored ideas around death and end-of-life well-being. So we were curious about how people we're approaching death and end of life, be that death and end of life care, if it's care planning, or thoughts about what comes after. And we were curious about how people were thinking about these issues in relation to aging and living well, as well as the specific ideals or plans that they had put in place. So in exploring these questions, we found that really important across the board questions of identity, family, as well as place. So while participants held a range of perspectives and beliefs about death and dying and end of life, a range of perspectives that were informed by cultural and spiritual backgrounds, as well as material circumstances, as they reflected identities and relationships with family seemed to be deeply shaping their thoughts on end of life as well as afterlife, as did questions of belonging and place in their ideas about what they would like for aging and living well up to and including dying. So one participant who was single shared, "I have only a couple of things that I have earmarked for individuals, and the rest I've designated to certain charities. This sounds terrible, but only because if I were to die without a will or without designating something, things would, by law, go to relatives. If for over 10 years nobody has even been around or been in touch, why should my meager amount be divided between siblings who don't pay any attention to me whatsoever?" So here we see someone thinking about what they may leave in their estate, and these reflections are telling us something about their family relationships and how the estrangement from siblings in this case relates to what they would like to happen to their belongings in the future. In the second quote here, a partnered gay man in his 60s shared, "Because of the age difference between my husband and I, probably I will be the first to go. When I die, I said to him, I want to be cremated and my remains taken back up where I grew up and buried with my mother. I don't want a service because I've been away from that community for 50 years. So in thinking about end of life and thinking particularly about burials or funerary services or what comes after, this sentiment was one that was commonly shared. So multiple participants had ideas about the places that they wanted to be laid to rest, and these were often places significant in their lives or the places where they had come from. But in terms of the social environment, they didn't necessarily see a need for any type of service or funeral or connection to the people currently living in that place because they had been aware or estranged for so long. So that is the very, very high level highlights from our research report. In terms of next directions for the project and for you as audience members, we wanted to wrap up by sharing a few details about other phases of the project and what you might consider doing next. So first is on the National Resource Center on 2S LGBTQI aging. So as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, this is a website that has already been developed and is available for you to access. So the National Resource Center on 2S LGBTQI aging, or the NRCA, is a resource center focused on the lived experiences of 2S LGBTQI older adults and aging issues in Canada. On that site, we have compiled links to the most current research and resources in this area with a focus on Canada. We also post regular blog posts, and the site has a 2S LGBTQI older adults resource map where you can search for local programs and services in your area. So we encourage you to check out that website, and feedback is always welcome, as are ideas for other resources to add. Secondly, please stay tuned for the upcoming virtual education modules. So the image here on this slide is from videos that will be part of a game in which learners will have choices to make about the direction of the story within these modules. So these modules are geared towards healthcare and social service providers and others who are working or would like to be working and supporting 2S LGBTQI older adults. They will be released in late March and be available in French and English. They are open access, so you will just need an email to register to get the link, but they are free. So please stay tuned for that. And on this slide, there is a web link to the page where they will be released.
So we also urge listeners to visit our report, which has way more details and experiences from our participants, linked here and also on the IGAL website for recommendations on policy and practice changes. We also encourage you to visit IGAL's allyship tips webpage, which is also linked here. And finally, we do recommend focusing efforts on building coalitions and solidarity with other communities to fight for our collective needs, as many of these issues are large and do not, of course, occur in silos. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Please feel free to get in touch with the IGAL research team or contact Celeste and I individually. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and please feel free to stick around for the question period.
And Hannah, I'll stop the screen share now if we want to go to questions.
Sounds good.
So there is a Q&A function in the chat if anyone had questions kind of while they were listening. Please feel free to pop those into the chat. I'll also note that in the chat, I see, and I believe audience members can see this, are links to some of the resources that we mentioned. So this includes the report, both in English and in French, the web link to the National Resource Center on 2S LGBTQI aging, as well as the tip sheets on allyship and the new IGAL Action Hub. Yes, so thank you. There's one question in the Q&A. Can you tell us about future directions for this work? Absolutely. So in terms of the research work, Ellie and I have plans, grand plans, but plans to publish further from this work. So especially we're hoping to prioritize publishing an academic publication with regards to the housing findings. So all of these findings are already in the report. That will just help us to reach a different audience and establish kind of our research findings as evidence in a different way. If anyone has recommendations about other groups, organizations that may be interested in learning more about the study, you can email research@igal.ca. We'd be very interested to hear where we might mobilize these findings. As I mentioned, the e-modules will be ready at the end of March, so we're working on those. And then the final phase of the research is the awareness campaign. So as part of that, we will be doing one final push to really get the research findings out there as well. I see another question. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the discussions had around intergenerational housing models. You briefly mentioned this, and it's something I'm really interested in. Ellie, do you want me to take this one, or do you want to? Okay. Yeah, so this is a fascinating area. Please go to the report and read more. What I can say from this report and other research that I've done and ongoing collaborations with IGAL is that this is something of high interest to a lot of people. So the idea that, you know, ways forward are not necessarily to silo people on the basis of age or on the basis of ability or even on the basis of identity, but instead to look at kind of mixed use housing and care environments where, you know, many different diverse people can live together, but in environments that are affirming. So what we found in this research was quite a desire for this, but quite a few roadblocks and some pessimism about how possible this is to make. So in other research that I've done, I've looked at some of the initiatives in Ontario that have been proposed over the past many decades. Like, this is not a new idea. And often they're collectives of people who try to pull this off and it kind of falls through, whether that's for, energy or group dynamics, or often finances and differences in financial situations. We are currently, Igal, myself, and a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, collaborating on a pilot research study called Querying Home. And in this, we're looking at shared housing models among 2S LGBTQI adults age 30 plus, not in kind of institutional care type settings, but more grassroots, and how adults, including adults of different generations, are creating these housing models on a smaller scale. So yeah, great question. It's a fascinating area. There's not a lot written that's out there, but there's definitely a lot of conversation about that. I see another question. Were there other differences between employed and retired? Example, income levels, which could have influenced access and quality of care. Ellie, do you want to speak to that? Since I think you were looking at income before we started the presentation.
Yeah, definitely. So we highlight this a little bit more in the report, but there were some instances where people were choosing to work partly just for the sense of purpose, or they'd kind of tried to retire and then ended up working again. But there were also people who Celeste spoke of a little bit, who felt they were pressured into working or needed to work. And that, from my memory, was kind of the larger group, but it were the people who were working had to. But there were some circumstances where they had higher incomes but ended up going back to work, but it was somewhat of a different circumstances. Celeste, do you want to speak any more to that?
Yeah, I think I'll just say, so the people who we spoke to at the time, most of them were not currently receiving home care or other types of support, but they had anxiety around their financial ability to purchase any form of private care in the future. So I think what this question is getting at is maybe how having money can help to access care when we're looking at privatized care systems. So while we didn't see that in participants' current circumstances, it's definitely something that they were extrapolating. And there's a comment in the chat as well about availability of accommodation for disabled persons. And absolutely, this was also part of the mix in our study. So about half of participants were living with a disability or chronic health condition. And this was also impacting kind of their anticipation of the types of care or new housing environments that they may need in the future. So overall, so the report is quite expansive. It covers a lot. And as a way to wrap up, I would really stress what Ellie said at the end, is that a lot of these issues around housing, employment, or care access, there are specificities about how that impacts 2S LGBTQI people. But I think there's a lot of common ground that we can find intergenerationally and with other communities. And this type of coalition building will be really, really necessary to get change to happen.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ellie and Celeste, for sharing your knowledge and research with us today. And thank you to everyone for popping in and contributing and asking questions. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to Ellie or Celeste or to our research team at research@egal.ca. And I wish everyone a good day. Take care.
Bye.